Hello, I'm Jonathan Mast, and welcome to this edition of the Sedgwick podcast. We've got two great guests with us here today talking about some really interesting topics in relation to theater and theater production and injuries and how that relates to the insurance industry and how those are processed and handled. So I'm going to let our guests introduce themselves.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I'm Freddie Cambanakis. I'm a media and entertainment adjuster in the UK here at Sedgwick. So I joined the company earlier this year. Media and entertainment, really, we cover everything from theatre, which we'll talk about today, but everything right through to film and TV production, live events, sports, all those sorts of things. So it's a really interesting team to be part of, and looking forward to the discussion today.
I'm Tome Levi. I'm the founder of the role of injury prevention consultant and the executive director of IPC, the consultancy that houses that role.
Well, I am excited to talk to both of you, and I think our guests are going to find this extremely interesting. So let's dive in with the first question and talk about what are some of the common types of risk that theaters and theater production might be exposed to that could result in an insurance claim. And Freddie, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks. I think broadly speaking, I'd say the risks fall into two sort of buckets which we can think about. The first are the same kind of risks that any other premises or any other business would be exposed to. So those are things like fires, floods, accidental damage, theft, all those sorts of things that insurance, typically will look to cover. I'd add to that very often the nature of the buildings that we're looking at. So particularly thinking about some of the theatres in the UK and in London, they can obviously very often be much older buildings than more modern business premises, and so they could be at even greater risk of some of those perils. You're also very often looking at lots of very expensive technical equipment inside them, which have their own specific risks attached to them. And then the second bucket, if you like, are risks that are more specific to the actual type of work that happens within a theatre. So thinking about what goes on backstage, you've got stage crew potentially working at height when they're rigging technical equipment, rigging lights, rigging speakers, those sorts of things. If it's a production house, if it's a theatre that's producing shows, you might have a workshop in the back where they'll be building sets and making props. Those come with their own risks as well. And I mentioned some of the specialist technical equipment which will be in the buildings as well. And then thinking about what's going on stage, depending on the nature of the show, you might have stunts going on. You could have stage combat. You could have a big musical production with lots of repetitive choreography. I think I could probably hand over to Tome, who might be able to talk a little bit more about that and the sorts of particularly injuries that you might see in a theatre production.
Thanks, Freddie. Thank you. So, yes, the risks that we look at would mainly come under the cast claim umbrella, and they're split into risk that's posed to the cast by the physical seed material itself, and therein the risk of show cancellations, and the two are, of course, very interconnected in the world of theatre. So we have obviously the physical demand of an acting or performance role is the primary risk factor for cast injury. This covers all scene material, be it stage combat, like Freddie alluded to, or very intense choreography, or even things like pedestrian movement repeated over and over again. So what we look for is whether the physical demand of scene material is sustainable in line with the frequency of performance, which for most shows, certainly West End productions, it's 8 times a week for a 12-month contract. Now, the theatrical model is traditionally comprised of a multi-tiered system of reactivity to when cast is incapacitated, otherwise known as understudying or covering. And despite this multi-tiered system, we still often see productions in sight of their point of failure, which is running out of people in the building to do the job. And that is usually because material isn't sustainable. And so we see performers pushing through it, getting injured, and then the same happening soon after to their understudies who are obviously engaging with the same material. And this inevitably results in clustered absences and puts a very unsustainable strain on company management and the wider production framework, and that is ultimately the thing that will lead to productions being cancelled, which of course is also reflected in claims.
Fantastic explanations. When we think about, obviously in the not too distant past, there have been some high-profile examples of cast injuries in the recent months. What can the implications be of a cast or crew injury on a production? How does that all play out? And we'll start with you again, Freddie, this time.
Yeah, I think the thing to say is obviously injury in theatre is nothing new, but there have certainly been some more high-profile cases which people may or may not have seen in the press in recent months. And obviously the first and most significant impacts will be on the person involved, on the injury, depending on the severity of it. That could, result in potentially a loss of income for them. It's an industry, certainly in the UK, and I'm sure it's the same in other parts of the world, but it's an industry that's made up of freelancers, people who are self-employed. And, if they injure themselves and they're unable to work, that's obviously a significant impact on them. And it could potentially lead to a liability claim for a production company or for a theatre, depending on the circumstances. As Tome mentioned, fundamentally, if there aren't mitigations in place, and if an injury does occur, that can ultimately lead to a cancellation or a cancelled show. And, some of the big productions, they may have understudies or swings, as Tome mentioned, but that's not always the case. And that in those circumstances, that's when you might see cancelled or delayed shows or tours, and then potentially, significantly, disappointed audiences is the first thing, and then potentially, large claims for insurers to deal with as well.
Yes, so as far as implications on cast and crew, it's a pretty long list. My company, IPC, actually launched last week the Impact of Injury survey specifically to explore the toll on cast and crew, as well as the economic impact on productions. But to your question directly, physically, of course, the acute and prolonged consequences of injury on the individual or individuals who have been injured, of course, but also emotionally, IPC's last study, the one that we published in 2022, showed that 85% of creatives experienced an increase in stress and anxiety due to injury occurring at work. So whether or not it was the person themselves who was injured or one of their colleagues, the impact on mental health was negative regardless. And the knock-on effect is really massive, especially when it comes to the connection to financial security, as Freddie mentioned, particularly for freelancers. And all of this can ultimately bleed into mental health-related absences. So an injury occurring in the first instance can actually lead to multiple absences further down the line across cast and crew, which can be reflected in claims further down the line as well.
So, Tome, let's stick with you and talk about what are some examples of best practice when it comes to mitigation of these risks in the terms of injury to the cast and crew, and that includes both on the stage and backstage, because it gets pretty hectic back there, I imagine, and lots of injuries occur.
It can be, yes. So IPC actually published a series of best practice guidelines specifically to address this issue. We look at protocols like risk assessment through the injury prevention lens in the development process and in rehearsals, adequate physical preparations in line with demand of the scenes themselves, things like emergency stop protocols, so having a very clear line of communication for actors, understanding exactly what they need to do in order to communicate that they want to stop either a rehearsal or an actual production if they're feeling unsafe or in jeopardy. Critically, and this is really one of the most important things, I suppose, when we're coming at the top-down workplace culture, we encourage producers to harness a psychologically safe work environment where everybody feels safe voicing concerns about their physical and mental well-being without fear of being penalized. I mentioned the survey that we launched last week. I had a look just before this recording, anecdotally, in less than a week since this launched. We've already seen a response saying 90% of people don't always feel able to voice a safety concern at work. And one of the key drivers for this is tarnishing professional reputation, not being rehired, and it's really one of the biggest obstacles that we face in theatre. And we really do need transparency and open dialogue in order to ensure that cast and crew are consistently safe. But given that we're talking about theatre specifically, I think it is really, really important that we highlight swings and understudies. Swings, of course, for anyone who isn't familiar with the lingo, is as someone who understudies multiple roles and jumps in wherever they are needed, and in line with who might be incapacitated of that particular evening or afternoon. They are widely considered to be the backbone of the theatre world, coming in last minute to save the day. But I think it's really important that we actually ask why the day needs saving so very frequently. And usually what it comes down to is that the material that the cast is engaging with is either unsustainable or unsafe, or both. And then it means that our last line of defense, these people that we are most reliant on to keep the curtain raised, and they feel that pressure every day, they find themselves in the same physically and mentally harmful position as their principal counterparts did when they were engaging with that material, who are now signed off with injury. And so the bottom line, really, when it comes to your question of best practice, is identifying red flags as early as possible in development, in rehearsals, and that gives us space to deal with the unforeseen if it occurs, and allowing cast to be armed with those solutions to engage safely with the roles that they've been cast in to improve their chances of getting through a contract uninjured.
Yeah, and I just completely agree with everything Tome just said. I'd add as well, certainly in terms of the idea of identifying red flags early on, certainly from my experience and from my previous sort of career in the creative industries and working in theatre, I think there has been a trend to have certain roles in the rehearsal room that perhaps weren't there, a decade or so ago. So you see in the emergence of things like intimacy directors and intimacy coordinators who are specifically in the room to look after, ensure that people's well-being are looked after, not just in the physical sense, but also, protecting mental health and making sure the actors know what they are and aren't supposed to be doing and what's to be expected in a rehearsal room. I think there's also been a trend recently to get union representatives in rehearsal rooms from earlier on. So certainly in the UK, Equity, the Actors Union, I think, has had a push to try and have more of a presence in rehearsal rooms to make sure things like best practice are being followed, and that there are risk assessments and safety briefings where necessary for things that need it. So yeah, lots of measures which I think we would look to see are put in place to make sure that those risks are mitigated.
Well, let's take a step back and talk about how can theaters adapt to stay ahead of changing audience trends, particularly post-COVID, which changed the world for that time for this industry. And where are we at now, Freddie?
Well, I think it's a really big question, and I think you're right, we are seeing changing audience trends, and that's not alone. That's not just in theatre, but in the creative industries more widely. We're seeing, and we have seen, huge changes in how people are consuming and digesting media and entertainment, and particularly post-COVID. Just thinking about the huge boom in streamers of the last decade, and certainly more since COVID as well. Thinking about, I was looking at some of the figures for Netflix in particular. I think in the UK, there was something like 14% of households had a Netflix subscription 10 years ago, and now it's somewhere between 60 and 70%. So there's been a huge shift in how people are wanting to consume media. In terms of what theatres can do, I'd start by saying nothing will ever replace going to a theatre, and there's nothing quite like sitting in an auditorium and sharing that experience with people live in the room. But I think we have seen theatres try to diversify what they're offering to audiences. So thinking about what other revenue streams they might be able to use, things like NT Live, so the National Theatre specifically, they'll broadcast their shows into cinemas. You'll be able to watch them from home if you like through a link. So just trying to draw in audiences where maybe they didn't have them before. That's one way of adapting to sort of stay ahead of the curve. I think we're in a really exciting time in terms of incorporating new types of technology into theatre. So it's very early days, and it's also something that's very expensive for theatres to experiment in. But things like virtual reality, I've been to a couple of shows in the last few years where you'll go and watch the show, and then afterwards you'll be in the foyer, and someone will tell you to put on a headset, and suddenly you're immersed in the world of the show. And so I think those are sort of, they're ways that theatres are trying to offer something new to audiences and draw people in ways that they may not have been drawn in previously. So I think, it's a really exciting time for the industry, despite all of the difficulties that they have in terms of, shortages of funding and getting shows off the ground. It is a really exciting space to be working in.
I echo everything that Freddie has said. Completely agree. I do think that a general adaptation of mindset and workplace culture when it comes to being more proactive, looking at investing in training the people that work in theatres to be quicker to adapt to a changing landscape, will create more room to react to the unexpected, something that COVID definitely taught us. Getting ahead of the game helps us be in a better position to address challenges as they arise.
Well, as we wrap this conversation up, and I think you both we stepped into the next question a little bit, but now we look ahead. As the industry evolves, what are some of the emerging risks that might be mitigated in the future? And just to jump in, Freddie, you mentioned here in the U.S. in Las Vegas with the Sphere that opened, that's a completely immersive experience in watching things happen on stage. I think we're going to see more of that. So what do we see coming down the pipeline?
So in the aftermath of COVID, we saw this rush to make up for lost time manifest in high cast injury rates for mental health outcomes and an increase in something called presenteeism, which is basically the practice of coming to work despite illness or injury. This was something that was also, of course, reflected in claims looking through the insurance lens. I do feel that with the budgeting pressures that we're seeing now as a result of COVID, we're now starting to see a repeat of this behavior, which is concerning, especially from the injury prevention perspective. That less investment in proactive care, combined with a push to shorten rehearsal schedules. So shows that used to rehearse a production in 6 weeks are now pushing to 5, sometimes even 4. It means that we are condensing a very high workload into unrealistic timeframes, which is a recipe for injuries. It's a recipe for claims. I think ultimately, in terms of risk mitigation, looking forward, the industry needs to take a pause, realize that looking after the workforce is looking after the work, is looking after the product, and that productions are existentially dependent on their people. There's no show without them, and so taking that time to really invest in their welfare ultimately will protect the product as well.
Yeah, I'd agree. Certainly that theme of budget pressure is something which seems to be, well, it's a perennial thing for the arts more widely and the creative industries. Squeezing budgets is always going to be a risk for increased cutting of corners and then increased risk of injury. I just add two very quick sort of macro points, and these are things that I think they'll impact all sectors, but they'll certainly be impacting theatre. The first is climate change. Increased frequency of extreme weather. We're going to see more disruption. Theatres are just as susceptible to floods as any other building. And also, not necessarily just indoor theatre, but thinking about some of the big outdoor music festivals we've seen. Certainly this year, there have been a couple of examples where there's been cancellations of they've had to cancel performances on stages because of high winds. I think that's something that we'll certainly see more of as the climate continues to change. And then the second one is, again, it's another macro factor, but we are in a much less stable world, I think, than we used to be. And the threat of terrorism is one that has become more frequent, more pronounced. Obviously, from an insurance perspective, typically those sorts of events tend to be excluded, but that's not to say that it's not a very real risk which theatres have to contend with. And again, certainly in the UK, we'll have legislation coming in, well, as and when it does, but there is planned legislation to introduce requirements on venues, including theatres over a certain size, that they'll need to have specific mitigations in place to minimise the risk of, or what to do in the event of a terrorist attack. I think that is just sort of a symptom of the changing world that we're in now. And certainly something to keep an eye on for the future.
Well, thank you both for taking your time today to share your insights, and I think it's definitely an area where if you haven't been involved in theater, sometimes you don't think about all the risks that go into it. So again, Tome and Freddie, thank you for sharing your thoughts, and we appreciate everyone listening today. So until next time.